Maybe we've all gotten used to the awkward Zoom meeting silence at the beginning.
Hello, everyone. This is Joe A. Not on video, just on cat.
Nice to meet you, Joe.
Thanks for coming.
You're not a cat. It's just a cat.
Maybe he is a cat.
Is Naomi back here?
I am indeed.
Hey, wonderful. Nice to see you in person almost.
Almost, right? Thank you.
I want to know where David G is. Wherever that is looks pretty.
Oh, I'm on my front porch. I live in
He lives on top of a mountain.
On top of a hill, south of Rochester, New York.
The mountain.
Enjoying the first day of spring.
Us too. Nice to see you, David.
Hey, Ben.
How you doing, David?
Yeah.
Good.
And Ben David.
Doing okay. Nice to see you guys. Thanks for coming.
Yeah.
Down here in Kentucky, it's a little warmer. We have daffodils and hyacinths and crocuses. Crocuses are almost done. It's pretty nice.
We're still waiting for our peepers to start peeping and our crocuses to pop up.
Start croaking?
Yeah.
That'll be interesting. Makes a very noisy background.
Oh, but it's great.
I think we're just going to wait a minute or two more for some people to join, and then we might get started. Right, Naomi? Are you started?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
We have an absolutely beautiful sunny day here in Rochester. Ben David also gets to appreciate this today because he's also here in Rochester, New York right now.
Here, close
And
to Rochester.
you too, right? Yeah.
So I could turn the computer around and show a few piles of snow that are still in front of our little.
I was just going to suggest that. We don't have any here in Rochester.
Yep, little bit of snow still, not much.
David, are you outside?
Yeah, I'm on the front porch now. Earlier, I was on the
cold
side.
out there.
It's
cold
no,
out
it's
there.
really quite nice, but it's too sunny on the other side now.
Oh.
Nothing like being too sunny.
All right, well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Yeah, so welcome everybody. I see a lot of familiar faces. Good to see you again. Yeah, so this is the fifth session of Incantare Talks. Standard Zoom fare, please leave yourself muted. Feel free to pop questions in the chat and we'll kind of answer them as they come up. And then we'll have dedicated question and answer time at the end. So with that said, I'm going to kick it over to Naomi, who's going to introduce the topic for today.
Hi, everybody, and thank you from me also for joining us today. I'm glad to be back in the United States with you guys. So today we're talking about planning a program, that whole process, how we think about it, what we do, and why we think it's important to take care with this and to give it kind of attention and some love. So just to give you an idea of where we're going to go, we're going to start with a brief pass around the whole panel on the topic of what we think is most important about putting together a concert, putting together a program of pieces, and why we think that's important to consider. Then we're going to move to two different case studies. We're going to talk specifically about two previous Incantare programs to kind of bring some of these points out. And then we'll close the last section of the talk with a kind of discussion of some of the more general musical considerations of how you might structure a program and think about combining pieces together and kind of making a great experience, we hope, for the listening audience out there. So let's start. I'm going to put this question to all the speakers today, and it's this. what's most important to you when you think about planning a program, and why is it that you think it's so important we take care with this, we discuss it here as well? And we're going to start with Ben David.
So I think that it is really important for a concert program to tell an interesting story. It could be about anything, like an interesting person or an object or an event, something historical. I feel like if it's something that I think is interesting, someone else will think it's interesting too. And that is why I want other people to hear that.
I think a lot of things are important, but I think a lot about finding a moment, it might be, or a particular movement of a piece that might be sort of the gemstone of the entire program and something that I really connect with while I'm playing it. And I think if I can sort of connect that deeply with a moment on a concert program, that I know that I can sort of connect with the audience in that way, that it becomes very obvious that I care very much about this, maybe particular moment in the story, maybe, or something that is like particularly beautiful. So, yeah, just finding that little diamond in the rough.
I love introducing new repertoire to our audiences and to our ensemble. We all have our favorite standards that we love to hear and love to play, but I think it's especially moving and special when we can find something that maybe no one has ever heard before, ever. Potentially this piece was never played during its time, or at least not since it was composed. So that's one of my favorite things.
One of my favorite things, sort of in tandem with Alice's favorite thing, is the contextualization of that repertoire. Where was it played? Why was it played? Who was involved in the playing of it? And what was the historical context? How was that relevant back then? Sort of looking to historically up to that point where the piece might have been performed or written or even not performed, and its use then, and then sort of putting it in perspective about sort of what it means for us as musicians, as audience members, as a modern society to be performing these pieces and understanding really what they mean.
Yeah, and I think it's important that that a program has a kind of a cohesive energy, that flows really nicely from piece to piece or from set to set. And I think why that's important is when it's done well, the program really becomes kind of greater than the sum of its parts and can become something special.
Thanks, everybody. I guess one of the things we're hoping you'll kind of feel as we go through this presentation is that there is so much behind this. And in some ways, if we're doing it right, you might not be very aware of it during the concert. But we'd also like to invite you at the end, if you have some thoughts about aspects of program planning that are particularly kind of interesting to you, or what it is that connects for you. We'd love to hear those at the end of the talk as well. I think it's interesting when we look at different types of music, different types of ensembles, how they approach this question of planning a program. I think it's something that early music ensembles often have to think particularly creatively about and take a lot of care with, for both practical reasons, and then also in this sense of wanting to communicate a story, often with music or composers that aren't known so well. And I do think it's something that this group, from coming into this group, I feel pay a lot of attention to, and I hope that you can feel that in the experience of the concert programs too.
Well, you can see from all of these different answers from everybody that we all have our own unique opinions about what should go into a successful program. And for us, talking to you as Incantare, I think that is exciting because all of those different opinions and personalities go into every single program. Everybody in our group is free and encouraged to come up with programs based on what they want to play, what they want you to hear, and how they want you to receive that music. And one of our goals is that all of our programs should reflect who we are, individually and as a group, because we're all doing this together, but we all have our own personalities and backgrounds. And I think after today, you'll see that that is reflected in some of the programs that we have already developed. So before talking about those programs, we would like to first say a little bit more about the main stages of program development, which include: how do you choose a topic? How do you research the music that is going to help you tell the story of that topic? How are you going to use all the music that you find to convey that story? And ultimately, how is it going to become a concert? How do you bring it to life? I would like to say a little bit more about the process of choosing a topic, because yes, it can reflect your personality. It can tell a story about you, yourself, the person who is coming up with these ideas. But if there are interesting ideas that connect one or more of us in our group to one another, then for sure some of these things will connect us to someone who's listening to us. One example of a story that a concert might tell that would maybe bring all of us together is, I don't know, a concert about music from plague times. Can you imagine how many concerts there are going to be about plagues after we're done here in these interesting times that we are all sharing together? So when it comes to picking an interesting idea or a topic, sometimes you don't have to dig very deep to find that, to come up with something that is deeply interesting and satisfying, not just for us, but for a lot of people. And of course, there's an entire range of possibilities, from things that everybody already knows that they're connected to smaller topics that maybe we don't always know until after we've heard this concert, that, you know what, actually that's really speaking to me. And we want to explore that whole range of things.
Thanks, Ben David. And so when you have this topic in mind, however you've chosen to define it, of course, your next stage is to go find out what music could be brought into this. So maybe you're starting with some composers in mind, or you have a specific time period, or you have some other kind of thread that's going to join everything together. And certainly for me, and I think for at least some of the other group members, this is a really fun bit, because you get to go sit in the library and pull out lots of books and find some pieces that look like they might be great. And at this point, you want to find a lot of stuff, because later on, you're going to have some other considerations in how you narrow this down. If you are lucky enough to live near a large library, like we are here in Rochester with Sibley Music Library at Eastman School of Music, that's great. There are also many resources now available online, some more trustworthy than others, of course, but what's particularly useful is when you can go and you can find scans of original parts, if you have the skills to turn that into an edition. If part of our kind of mandate is to bring music that's not known so well, sometimes we might want to be bringing some music where there isn't a good modern edition, and we might then make our own edition of that music. So there are lots of possibilities for us, but at this point, it's just to really get in there and kind of get to know what repertoire is available.
And once we have gone through those processes, the next step is to take all of that music that we have picked out of the library and find out what makes those pieces of music make sense together, which is a combination of doing a little bit of historical research to find out how the different musicians who wrote some of that music were connected to one another, or maybe how their employers were connected, or what sorts of traditions they belonged to in the places that they lived at the time that interests us, and where our repertoire is from. And it's a combination of that and the rehearsal process of crafting, finding ways to combine and arrange these pieces in a way that creates a fun performing and listening experience for everyone.
And so that really is the sort of the final element in all of this, is having gathered all your possibilities, your kind of storyline, your connections. Then there's a sort of practical component where, like Ben David says, you have to think about, actually, we now need to realize this into a specific program of a specific length with our performers. And we'll talk about those general considerations then about how you might think about structuring that, what your decisions are later on in the program. I see that Doug's put a question in here, and it's a very good one. Maybe it's in other people's minds. He says, do you take turns introducing a program concept and then develop it as a group? Or do you collectively toss out ideas and gradually winnow it as a group? I don't know if anybody wants to take the answer to that on the panel here.
I can maybe speak to that a little bit. I think we kind of do a combination of both. I would say, some of us have ideas and then we all work together to make it happen, or we collectively know we want to put on a concert that features some really cool piece that we've heard or we know about. And so we figure out a way to make a program around a single piece and to make it part of a cohesive program. So we definitely do both those things, and both are very rewarding and fun.
Thanks, Alice. So we're going to move into the next section of our talk, where we're going to talk about two specific case studies, two previous programs that Incantare have presented. And I'm going to invite Ben David to talk here about the first one.
Yeah, so what we just talked about was essentially a jumping off point. And from here, we just want to see how we can use those main elements to come up with things that are uniquely us. So I'm going to be talking about our very first program, From Darkness into Light, which focuses on the music and culture of musicians in 30 Years' War era Germany. But before I say a little bit more about that, we would like to share a video from our very first concert of this program. It is an Intrada by Johann Rosenmüller. So the 30 Years' War is an historical event that is ripe for storytelling. It is an event in history that is marked famously by another event called the Defenestration of Prague, in which a nobleman was thrown out of a second story window into a trash heap. This essentially kicked off a conflict that was primarily caused by tensions within the power structure of the Holy Roman Empire, and also those caused by the Protestant Reformation and Catholic anti-Reformation in Germany. For music and musicians in Germany at the time, the war had devastating effects, but still somehow left behind an extraordinary body of wonderful music that we still enjoy today. Musicians living in Germany at the time, while contending with extremely limited resources, were surprisingly prolific, and somehow they also increased their contact with one another in and outside of Germany. The most famous example of which is probably of Heinrich Schütz, who during his lifetime twice traveled to Venice, once before the war to study with Giovanni Gabrieli, and again later in 1628 to study with Claudio Monteverdi. Which is a little bit ironic that we think about Schütz, because unfortunately he didn't make it onto our program because his music for trombones doesn't exactly fit with our instrumentation, which is really sad, because if I could pinpoint one thing, and maybe somebody else can elaborate a little bit more on this, if I could pinpoint one thing that really probably inspired this program, it would, at least in large part, be because of Heinrich Schütz. Because for him, at least for a lot of trombonists, I would say that the music of Heinrich Schütz is like a gateway into this style of music that people would tend to play on trombones. And it's a really incredible introduction to the music, not only of the 30 Years' War, but also of historically informed music making, the way that we like to do it. And it's just a really interesting story. So while we're really sad that we couldn't get Schütz onto this program, we'll have to get him onto another one. But stories like that are the stories that we want to tell. And to be honest with you, a big part of the fun of designing this program was to highlight lesser known connections between the musicians who we did feature on the concert. Okay, so essentially we've picked this time in history that we know is filled with great music, both well-known and not as well-known, and we want to figure out how to put that together. And we actually did find out that because of those connections, a lot of the musicians that we featured have very deep connections to one another. I just wanted to rattle off a few examples. So we started this program with a Yiddish folk tune, which is attributed to the Danish trumpeter Gabriel Voigtlander, whose popularity reached the likes of both Johann Vierdank, who set the tune Als ich einmals Lust bekam before it was even published. He set it as an instrumental sonata. And this tune was in a collection that Voigtlander put together, which was well known in Germany before it was published. It also was set, some of his poetry was also set to music by some other major composers like Andreas Hammerschmidt. And of course, both Hammerschmidt and Vierdank are also featured heavily on this concert. Vierdank was also a student of William Braid, whose music also appears on our program. Samuel Scheidt and Johann Schein, who are often held in nearly the same level of esteem as Heinrich Schütz, must have had a close personal as well as professional relationship because Shine actually chose Scheit to be the godfather of his own daughter, Susanna, in 1623. Johann Schoop and William Braid worked together, both in Hamburg and Copenhagen, in the court of King Christian IV. And not only were they connected professionally, but their careers were both upended and completely turned on its head by the war and some of the after effects of the war. They were both driven out of Copenhagen by a plague and ended up working together again back in Hamburg later on. We don't know if Hammerschmidt ever knew we don't know if Johann Rudolf Alle, who wrote this wonderful Magnificat that we close this program with, if he ever knew Hammerschmidt. But we do know from looking at his musical compositional style that Hammerschmidt was a major influence on his musical style. And we not only know that by looking at his music, but we know it because we're just aware that Hammerschmidt had a really powerful influence and a really great impact on the direction of German music at the time. Much more so than we generally give him credit for today. So these are just some of the connections that we wanted to put together. I kind of skipped over to crafting the story a little bit, but there's obviously lots of different avenues to go to create an interesting story that puts all these people together. To research the music, we spent all of that fun library time. We're also lucky that some of these pieces of music which only exist in manuscript are available online because some kind souls have made digital copies of them. A great example of that is the William Braid Chorale, which is not a very well-known piece, but it's an extremely important piece. We generally believe that that is the earliest violin solo ever to be composed by an English musician. And it's just unbelievable that this piece of music only exists in manuscript and that we actually were able to get a digital copy of this thing to put in our program. It's really amazing. And every single piece on this program came from a different source. Most published works, but a couple of unusual gems as well. Just in case you're keeping count, that's about 15 different sources of music just to make this one concert. And that doesn't count all of the sources that we put together and didn't end up using. I remember standing in the library copying entire collections of Hammerschmidt dialogues that we never ended up getting to put on a concert, but which taught us a little bit more about these people and their wonderful music and the impact that they had. It was really a delightful experience to find these connections and decide which ones we really want to feature. And ultimately, when it comes to bringing these pieces to life and figuring out what works, we had to actually get together and work on it, which is kind of hard when everybody lives in a different state almost. So ultimately, we had to just jump in head first, fly to Minnesota, and do a lot of our crafting together in person. And I think that is probably a good overview of our first program. So next, Liza is going to tell us a little bit about a much more recent program, Exile. And before she does, we would also like to share another video of a wonderful madrigal by Salomone Rossi called Shir Ha'amalot, which we all six of us performed together. Actually, I think Naomi might have sat this one out. I can't remember off the top of my head. But we performed it last February at Hobart and William Smith in Geneva, New York.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the context for this piece and the program Exile, which actually still in its full form has not yet been performed. It was scheduled for 1 week after lockdown began in March 2020, and it has finally been rescheduled for April 2022. So we are really excited to finally get the program as it was intended to be, for 4 singers and 6 instrumentalists off the ground in New York City and at Rutgers in New Jersey. But I am going to talk a little bit about this second case study of how this program came to be. Ben David mentioned Schütz as this very exciting and very well-known composer during the 30 Years' War period that we actually did not end up performing on our first program. And in a way, the fact that we ended up performing music from much lesser known composers shaped the mission and the future of our group. What happened was that we started to discover that there are certain reasons that certain people or groups of people maybe they retain an artistic legacy, meaning that today we might remember very specific people such as Schütz or Bach or Monteverdi, but maybe we've forgotten names like Hammerschmidt and Ala. But nevertheless, those people wrote incredible music and were possibly well known in their day, but sometimes not. Nevertheless, we hundreds of years later are not as familiar with those people. And a lot of that has to do with the circumstances surrounding the creation of those works of art. And that sort of led us to this mission that we have of sort of upending artistic legacy a little bit by exploring these cultural exchanges. So, Exile is a program about Jewish musicians in the 16th and early 17th century, as well as the non-Jewish musicians that they interacted with. And what's very interesting about exploring the art of marginalized societies is that you find out that nothing is as black and white or separate as it seems. Very similar to today, groups of people would interact with each other on sort of, an everyday cultural basis, cultural exchange. The ghetto in Venice was open during the day, and there was trade, and there was artistic and cultural and financial interactions, and everybody kind of moved together in this flowing society where the wheels just kept turning. And as a result, artists influenced one another quite a bit. And we have come out with this amazing sort of kaleidoscope of repertoire that it still exists today, but maybe has not been put in context. So the Birth of Exile, our program, takes some of these works, some of them by more well-known Jewish composers, such as Solomoni Rossi, who composed the motet that that Ben David just mentioned, and then some other Jewish or composers who maybe were thought to be Jewish before they converted, usually under duress, such as Muzio Ephraim, who was a madrigalist who worked quite a bit in the Gonzaga court with Monteverdi, and the Bassanos, who are sort of famously conjectured and probably were of Jewish origin, who some of them stayed in Italy and some of them migrated to England and performed in the court of Henry VIII. So we had this concept really that was sort of, we started with the 30 Years' War, and then out of this were born other concepts. So how do we then put this new concept, Jewish composers and their contemporaries, together as a program? And I think that the thing that really helped to shape this was we were able to sort of have the luxury of getting a full week at Avaloq. We did an artist residency there, and we got together, and we had all previously done some of this library research that Ben David mentioned and that Naomi and everybody else mentioned. So we had some idea of where we wanted to start. But Avaloq gave us this sort of week-long, 24/7 opportunity to find this material and then just play it. And we actually sort of exhausted ourselves in the first couple of days. We played so much that we realized after 2 days, the trombonist, like our chops were just like completely dead. So we had to sort of, for the rest of the time, be like, okay, we're gonna play for like an hour, and then we're gonna take a break, and we're gonna do some research, we're gonna do some admin, and then we're gonna play for another hour. And the point of all of this is to transform these sort of esoteric, like historical storylines into concrete musical sets where we were able to just play, and in some cases we had to imagine, right? We only had 4 of us, so we had to sort of play around with, okay, is this going to work with 6 people? Is this going to work with vocalists? Do we want continuo for this? And does this piece actually sound good? Because, you know, we have to evaluate also as artists and musicians if, you know, the music that we're going to perform, is this something that we like? Does it work for our group? Is it going to be interesting for an audience? And what connections do each piece have to each other? So for a good example is this beautiful sonata by Farina that Alice plays on the violin. And Farina has another connection to sort of these, he was not a Jewish composer, but had quite a few connections to people who were Jewish that he worked with. And we were able to sort of say, okay, we love this piece. It's absolutely beautiful. It's a great showcase for Alice. And it's an opportunity for the trombonists to take a little chop break during the program. And now this is going to sort of be our transition maybe into a larger piece. And we were able to sort of start to congeal. It really feels like it feels like if you're looking at kind of like close up at like a pointillistic picture, and then you gradually start to zoom out, and as the program comes together, it becomes this full picture, and it's really incredibly satisfying. And I will say one other thing about this, about Exile, before we move on, and that is this sort of practicality element of our programs. So the Exile in its full form is for 4 singers plus our group, and however many continuo that, you know, we want. And that is sort of idealistically what we want out of this program, because there's so much vocal music that fits so well with our instrumentation. The piece actually that we just played for you is originally a vocal motet that was written for a liturgical situation, which would not have had instruments at all. It would have been only voices. But and that's another side note consideration, which is we want to say, okay, how would this piece have been performed? Is it okay that we're going to perform it another way? Why is it okay? So just to take this case in point, while maybe the original Hebrew motet, which is a sacred motet, would not have been performed in instruments in a liturgical situation because that would not necessarily have been allowed, if we're taking it out of that context and putting it in a concert setting, where it would have been the performance practice of that day to interchange voices and instruments, suddenly you have this other context in which this is appropriate and even acceptable. And that leads me to this practicality element of a program, which is that what if we don't have resources to have like a 12-person concert, right? You know, unfortunately, cost is a part of program planning. We never have this sort of unlimited budget where we can program whatever piece we want to. It would be amazing if we could, but we have to work within our limits. And sometimes we're going to have more freedom to have more people and be more expansive. And then sometimes we won't, and we'll have to work with just our core ensemble. And in this case, we were able to sort of scale Exile down so it became playable by instrumentalists, just us. and form a kind of, we actually piloted this program on our last tour, and we were really pleased with how it turned out. So I'm really excited to actually keep on performing it this way. So we know that this program can work for both scaled down and scaled up situations, which gives us a lot of flexibility. And that, I would say, is another element to this process. And I think that's it for now, and I will pass it on.
Awesome. Thank you, Liza, Ben, David. I'm sure fascinating. It's always like good to hear how other people think about this too. I don't do program planning as much as these folks do. So you've heard all about sort of the process of tracking down music and where things intersect, and sort of collecting maybe a pile of music that, on paper might sort of amount to this for something. And then we are, given this job to take it down to maybe here, and to find approximately 70 minutes of music that will fit into a program. And just to kind of give the practical considerations here a shout out, how we put these things in order. We think a lot about tempo. We think a lot about what key something might be in. We also think about the timbre, which I'll get to a little bit later. And there's one more and I'm blanking on it. I'm sure I'll remember it later. Affect? Affect. It must be affect. Which are all things that, on a very basic level, we don't want our concert to have all of the calm, maybe slightly slower, introspective music to be on the first half, and then to play the second half with all of the fast music. So nobody wants that. We want like a nice flow that brings your heart rate up and down and gives you opportunity to, think about maybe what just happened, or if you leave a piece if we play something that's going to leave a giant smile on your face, what do we want to follow that? How does this fit together for like a really nice sonic experience for everybody that's there, and, frankly, for ourselves too, so that it really feels good. And a lot of this we have to think about because somebody else has not thought about it. So instead of playing like a complete work, to put an obvious example, like the St. Matthew Passion, for example, Bach has clearly thought about the keys, the structure, all this stuff. It's laid out exactly how, he thought it should go, and you don't have to think about that. But when you are doing a project like this, where, you may pick 25 different pieces of music, each of which consist of a minute of music up to maybe 5 minutes of music, how to piece these things together so it really does feel like a complete work, or like a complete story that we're crafting together, is a big job. And putting these sets together, something I'll let Alice talk about, but figuring that out is definitely a challenge, but also a fun one. I mentioned texture or timbre, but we do have this advantage of having, at best of times, a keyboard player, 3 saxophones, 2 violins. And with that, there are pieces that might use half of us, or all of us, or 2/3 of us. So to create that variety in a program, so that it's not always the same sound that you're getting, that we're sort of, for lack of a better word, sort of orchestrating the sound so that it's makes sense. So I'll pass this over to Alice to talk about sort of how we put these pieces together.
Thanks, Cynthia. So going off of what Cynthia was just saying, we have a ton of little short pieces. So how do we create not just a program of 1 minute piece, 1 minute piece, 1 minute piece that aren't somehow connected? So we make sets. We create these sets of music where we put anywhere from 1 or maybe 5 pieces together. And so there are a lot of considerations that we talk about when we're deciding what pieces to combine into either a single set or a group of sets. There are a few broad choices you usually make, like Cynthia was mentioning, like tempo, orchestration, which means, which instruments are playing at any given time, and the mode or key area. And sets can be as many or as few pieces as we choose. And they can fill a variety of time constraints or other programmatic needs. And we can play around with repeats to make things longer or shorter, depending if we need 30 more seconds or something like that. We can sort of change things and even on the spot, sometimes we have to say, oh, we don't have as much time for this particular concert. We need to cut some things. Let's cut some repeats. Like if we're given only an hour slot and we normally play it in an hour and a half or something like that. That's a kind of extreme, but you get the idea. We can play around, making sets also takes into account surrounding sets and how they relate. And you can find some examples of sets that we've created in our videos on YouTube and on our website. So within tempo, we generally have fast and slow. And even within the tempo category, we find active versus static or stasis. So because even in slow movements, we can have fast notes. And one example of this is from an Alamon that we performed in Louisville in 2019. And the harmonic motion is on the slow to medium side, even though there are a lot of notes above the slow harmony. And so this is sort of a nice middle way where it's a very sort of restful piece, but with some activity on top. And so that can contrast with some very fast things or even slower. And Garrett's going to play a little excerpt here. Another consideration is orchestration, like has been talked about a little bit, which just means what instruments or voices are used at a specific time and in a specific piece. And this can mean that, an ensemble of 6 with equal parts, or a solo sonata with only 3 players, but one person is featured, like myself on a violin sonata with continuo, or a full ensemble of 10 people, 6 instruments, 4 voices. Like you might have noticed in the Shir Hama Alat video that we played before Liza spoke, we chose not to have Naomi on keyboard for that piece because in context, we needed a texture change. So we've been playing a bunch of pieces with just the 6 of us. So we decided to not have Naomi play in that. But then she played in a bunch of other stuff, and we can do that and make those changes. And she could have played in that piece as well, and that would have been great. But we wanted to vary it a little bit. Sort of last general category is that we take into consideration is a mode or the key. And for those of you who don't know, mode is just an earlier version of what key became later. And this is one of the more straightforward choices because, we don't want to have a jarring transition between 2 very incompatible key areas, like from F to G or something. I mean, we maybe could make that work, but that goes from flats to sharps, and those aren't so far away from each other, but it's sort of nice if you have some flat pieces to keep the flat pieces together. If you have some sharp pieces, keep those together. And so we kind of try to choose related pieces that way. But, when you have someone like Naomi, who's so good at improvising, she can connect anything. She can improvise a little connection between any key, and that is super wonderful. And so sort of taking all those choices and putting them together might go something like this. So say we need a set that's about 6 minutes long. We have several pieces in F and B flat, which are related key areas. And these pieces are in a variety of tempos, but they all have the same orchestration, say for 5 equal parts. So how do we make variation and interest in this set? We might choose to make a set that has a format of a fast, slow, fast. So maybe 3 pieces, fast piece, slow piece, fast piece for tempo variety. We know that the key areas are related. So in this case, the piece order means a little bit less. Even with these variations, it might be tiresome to a listener to hear the same orchestration for a full set, like we just talked about. So we like to change it up. Say we all play the first piece, but for the second slower piece, we all play it through the first time, but just the soprano and bass lines play it through the second time because you've already heard the harmony. So then we just sort of break it apart and have only sort of the just the outer lines play it. And then this leads directly, or what we call attacca, into the next piece without pause, that where we, if you remember, is fast, and where the soprano or the soprano line, the top line and the continuo play the first section by themselves again, but in this completely different tempo, and then the 2D ensemble joins for the rest, and we do all the repeats. And this can make for a very exciting individual set. We can also make sets by related compositional material, such as when a piece is based on another piece. We have a perfect example of this from our 2018 debut concert, where we performed a madrigal by Strigio for 6 voices. Here in the video, you'll see the orchestration decision was made by us to have voices and instruments playing directly into a violin sonata composed about 50 years later by Chopin, which was based on that Strigio madrigal. Because they are related, the ending note from the Strigio is the same as the beginning note of the Chopin, and so we chose to go directly from one to another by having our keyboard player hold a D, which is the ending note. So if you listen really carefully, it's a little bit hard to hear in the recording. The piece will end, the first one will end, and then a D continues to play, and then I walk up and I start to play the violin sonata that is based on the first piece. So, okay.
Yeah, so I think that transition was a particularly effective one. Made more dramatic by the rolling thunder in the background from the storm, which we didn't plan on, but made it kind of cool. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about a few more practical considerations, as we're kind of ordering the program and creating sets. Liza alluded to this earlier, but the having 3 trombone players in the group, we have a finite amount of time that we can play, before our chops will die a slow and painful death. So we're very intentional about kind of programming in breaks for ourselves, which adds to the variety, by the change in instrumentation. So like an example of that was the dance suite excerpt that we played while Alice was talking. That piece that was violins only was, I believe, the third piece in a 5-piece dance suite. So that gave us a little bit of a break, us trombone players, between the first half of it and the second half of it, and also added some variety. Another consideration is like what goes into choosing the piece you start the concert with or the piece you end the concert with, which are very important decisions. And I would say there's really no kind of right or wrong answers here. But what's important is to be intentional about what you're going for. If we're speaking about the last piece of a concert, you could have a lively piece that would kind of send off the audience, or you could finish with a quiet piece that is a little more reflective and introspective. And those can both be effective and valid ways to end the concert, but you just need to be intentional about what you're going for. If we're speaking about opening pieces, usually we try and pick something that is going to be accessible to the audience. Something that maybe you wouldn't be aware of is like we also like to pick a piece that's going to be very comfortable for us to play. So maybe something we're familiar with and we performed before. But starting the concert off with a piece that we know we can play well and nail, builds confidence for us on stage, and can help really get the concert started on a good foot. So all these things we've talked about today are great on paper. We'll go into a concert week with kind of a plan and a program, but sometimes they're not always the way we planned, right? So this is workshopping and rehearsing these programs is invaluable. Oftentimes we'll play through something, and say, we thought that was going to work, doesn't quite work how we thought. So we'll, add or remove programs. Others alluded to, we often have way more music than we could ever fit on a concert. So we have, lots of options to slot in different things, or we'll often change around the instrumentation to give us the effect that we're looking for. So this whole, particularly the rehearsing and workshopping, is a very kind of organic process. There's no kind of checklist to create a good program. You just kind of have to, throw something out there as a starting point and then try it and see what happens. So that said, I'm going to kick it back to Naomi to kind of wrap this up.
Yeah, thanks everybody. So I hope today in this hour's presentation, we've given you a bit of an insider's view. We've kind of lifted the lid a little bit on this whole process of bringing a program to life from, these initial starting points, these ideas, and then practically all the stages we go through to do that. And as I say, in some senses, if we're doing it right, maybe you're not even aware of some of this stuff, right? But we hope it's been an interesting kind of reveal of some of the things we think about as we put this together. And we would invite your questions or comments at this point, if anybody's got anything they'd like to pop in the chat or speak to us here. I know we answered a few questions as we were going through as well. Yes, thank you. So Doug says that we, thank you, Doug. I'm going to repeat the compliment if that's okay. You are bringing wonderful period music to the public, much of which may be unfamiliar to most of us. Have you considered commissioning new music written for this type of ensemble? I think that's such a great question. I wonder if anybody can speak to that from the ensemble.
This has been mentioned, but not yet in a serious context. But I know that when we have gotten together as a group, this idea has been sort of like batted around casually. So I'm not going to speak for everybody, but speaking for myself, that does seem like an exciting concept, and I think could help to contextualize some of the original music as well. So you never know what will happen.
I think this puts me in mind of something they do at the Memorial Art Gallery here in Rochester. So if you go to the Fountain Court, where we have this beautiful Italian Baroque organ, it's full of Italian Baroque art, but they also put 20th century or, contemporary works alongside those old masterpieces that have some sort of thematic connection. Sometimes it can help you see them in a different way. And so I wonder about this process of, if you have a piece on the program that's written for historical instruments, but by, a living composer, maybe it allows us to experience something differently or hear something differently. And I think that modern day composers are so sensitive to sound also and color, that it would be a very interesting thing, I think. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, to add on to that, when we did our workshop week at Avaloq Farms, we were one of many ensembles and people there. And there were a lot of people there doing new music, some composers and musicians and ensembles. And it was really interesting to talk with them. We would all have dinner together. And yeah, so, that's a side of classical music that, I personally am not as familiar with. So it was very interesting talking to them and their process. And I wouldn't be surprised if we, made connections with someone through something like that would turn into a program later on.
That also, it was interesting to follow up on what Garrett was saying, that at Avaloq, we were the only historical ensemble there at the time. There are other ensembles, colleagues of ours who have gone, but many of the contemporary ensembles had never heard historical trombones or baroque violin, or even knew that it was possible to combine our instruments together. And so the other ensembles got to hear it, and the composers that were in residency there got to hear it, and we got to hear all their works. And it was a really incredible and very inspiring experience that we had.
So we have another question, great question too, from Jim. How does the venue influence a program? Actually, funnily enough, this is something we spoke about whether to include in this presentation to you today. Just to kick off, of course, I'm an organist, so space is often, when you're programming music with organ, space is a major consideration, acoustic. Of course, with organists, the instrument you're playing is the instrument that's in that space. We talked a little bit as a group about, have we been involved in concerts where groups use the space, particularly kind of interestingly. So yeah, it's certainly a consideration. But then on the other side, sometimes we're planning a program, we want to take it to several different places, want to take it to different cities, different venues. So there needs to be a kind of practicality about its sort of usefulness in different places. I don't know if anyone else wants to pick up from that too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the venue influences probably the rehearsal process more than it does our program creation, at least up to this point for us. Because as we're playing in different spaces, we're rehearsing in the venue, and it's okay, what sounds good in here? What's the best way we can stand? What's the best way we can hear ourselves? So it definitely affects kind of the rehearsal process leading up to the concert, definitely.
I see Doug also threw another question in there. Any composers of specific interest at this time? I would really love to make this sort of new music for old instruments happen. But as of right now, personally, I don't know if anybody else does.
Doug, are you asking about living composers or historical composers?
I think he's saying living composers. Is that right?
Oh, living composers.
Yeah.
Oh, my answer is the same as Al.
Yes.
But clearly it's something we might be talking about. And we have a question about, do we have regular singers, or does that change sort of depending on which city location we're in? That's not something I can really speak to, but maybe someone else can.
We do have certain singers who we feel really comfortable performing with. You'll see Clara singing alto on quite a few of our programs. I think the answer to that really varies. We have people that we just love to work with, and you can all correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in an ideal circumstance where we have sort of an unlimited budget, we will go first for the people that we have performed with in the past and we know are going to really work well with our group, and we can create the sound together that we want. But there are also just incredible singers in the cities that we perform in, which is a huge privilege when we get to work with those people as well. So for example, for our program coming up for Exile, I'm really excited to work with some New York singers who are just fabulous. So really, it's a win-win no matter what, and it really just varies depending on circumstance.
I'm wondering if there's anyone out there who wanted to ask a question who's not on chat but could just speak if you're on the phone or something. Is there anybody out there in that circumstance? No. Anybody else got anything else?
Or if anybody on our anybody on our YouTube and our YouTube audience, hi YouTube audience.
Hi YouTube audience.
If anybody has a question there, I think you can post it. Is that right, Garrett? In the
Yep, I'm watching the chat.
I'm also kind of wondering if some of our audience wants to share with us what they like best when they go to a concert. What is the thing that stands out to you? Like, what do you look for in this kind of concert?
no wrong answers.
See, Jean's got an answer. Oh,
You're
you just
Maybe you didn't want to hear it anyways. No, for me, it's been interesting because I didn't know anything about early music. And I have attended concerts in Rochester with a couple different groups, and I really found a great interest in it. I don't know much about early music, but I'm learning, particularly thanks to Incantare. So I guess I would say I like the early music better than modern music, for example.
terrific. Thank you, Jean. Thank you. We're glad you're joining us.
I'm glad to be here. I did have another question. When you're picking the music, how do you resolve disagreements among yourselves? Are you able to all agree on something, or how does that work?
Fisticuffs. No, I think
Well, you're in different cities, so.
Well, we're all friends and colleagues, and we respect and care about one another's opinions, and so we are constantly having dialogues with one another, either through text messages or on Zoom, or when we're really lucky, in person, where everybody has absolute freedom and safety to speak their mind and their heart, and there's a space for that, and we all respect it, and eventually these things work themselves out.
That's wonderful. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. So I guess at the end of all this, I hope that you've got this sense of the journey of putting the program together. And, you know, in the end, what we want to do is create concerts that are meaningful to you and are a satisfying musical experience. And of the many ingredients that go into that, that's what we really hope to be doing here for you. So I'm going to hand over to Alice, who's going to finish us out here.
Thank you all so much for coming again to our 5th one. It's hard to believe that we've done 5 of these already. It kind of just started out as a thing we thought would be fun, and it is still really fun, and we're still going. So keep an eye out for the next email, and we'll say when the next one will be. We don't quite have it scheduled yet. Thank you to our Zoom audience and also to our YouTube audience, who we never know who you are, but we're glad that you're watching. And, you know, it's so great to see so many familiar names and faces here, and we're so grateful for all of your support. And as always, you know, I'm sorry, we have to say it. we always welcome donations so we can keep this content coming, but we know that many of you are extremely supportive of us, and we are so thankful. And we hope that you'll come to the next one as well.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
It's been very good.
Thank you all. Good program. Thank you.